Late 1970s. A hospital corridor that smells too clean to be comforting. Dean Martin walks slowly, shoulders slightly rounded, dark glasses hiding eyes that no longer bother pretending. They're not there for style. They're there so no one can see where his attention keeps falling. Down, to the floor, to the line between the tiles. No cameras. No jokes waiting in reserve. Just a man passing time he didn't plan to spend here. A nurse he has never met steps into his path. She doesn't ask for an autograph. She doesn't smile. She doesn't even use his name. She says one sentence, quietly, precisely, the kind of sentence no one dares to say to a legend. Not out loud, not to his face. A sentence that doesn't accuse him of anything, which makes it worse. Dean stops. The joke forms automatically, like muscle memory. It always has. This is where he would deflect, soften the moment, turn it into something harmless. He doesn't. For the first time in years, he lets the silence stay. That pause, short, unnoticed by anyone else, becomes the moment everything begins to tilt. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The corridor smelled of antiseptic and something faintly metallic, a clean, sharp odor that never quite left the back of the throat. It was late afternoon, that hour when hospitals seem to hold their breath between visiting hours and evening rounds. The lights were too bright, unforgiving. Every step echoed longer than it should have. Dean walked slowly, not because anyone told him to, but because his body had decided the pace without asking. The chart clipped at the foot of his bed carried words he avoided reading. Lungs, exhaustion, tests scheduled and postponed. No reporters waited outside. No photographers. He had checked twice before agreeing to come. This wasn't a performance. This was maintenance. Quiet. Necessary. Unglamorous. His shoes made a soft sound against the polished floor. He kept his eyes low, following the thin, dark line where tile met tile. It was easier that way. Floors didn't ask questions. "Mr. Martin." The voice stopped him without urgency. Calm. Female. Not young. Not old. He turned, expecting the usual. An autograph request disguised as professionalism, a smile stretched a little too wide. The nurse stood a few steps away, hands folded, posture relaxed. She didn't hold a clipboard. She didn't glance at his face the way fans did, searching for confirmation that the man matched the idea. She looked at him the way people look when they're trying to decide whether to speak at all. "You know," she said, almost conversationally, "everyone here thinks you don't care." He waited for the rest. It didn't come. She continued, evenly. "But people who don't care don't stare at the floor when they walk." The words landed without drama. No accusation. No softness either. Just a statement, placed carefully, like something fragile set down between them. Dean smiled out of habit. The expression came easily, trained over decades. "Guess I'm just watching where I'm going," he said. The corridor answered with silence. The nurse didn't smile back. She didn't correct him. She didn't use his title, didn't call him Dean, didn't call him anything at all. That, more than the words, unsettled him. "I've seen men who don't care," she said. "They're loud. They fill every space so they don't have to listen to themselves." Her gaze didn't waver. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't kind. She was precise. Dean shifted his weight. His chest felt tight. Not pain, not yet, just pressure. He thought of a joke, something self-deprecating, something that usually worked. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rattled. A phone rang and was quickly silenced. The building breathed around them, indifferent. She took a small step back, as if realizing she'd already said more than she should have. "Your tests are scheduled for tomorrow morning," she added, professional now. "Try to rest tonight." He nodded. That much he could manage. As she turned away, he noticed something then, not recognition in her eyes, but understanding. The kind that didn't come from newspapers or television. The kind that came from watching people when they thought no one was looking. Dean stood there long after she disappeared into another hallway. He didn't move toward his room. He didn't straighten his jacket or adjust his posture. The legend wasn't required here. The floor line blurred slightly as he stared at it. He let it. For once, there was no audience to disappoint. The story people liked best was the easy one. Dean with a glass in his hand, tie loosened, eyes half-lidded as if he'd wandered onto the stage by accident and decided to stay. The slurred timing that never quite slipped. The laughter that felt reckless, but always landed exactly where it should. Audiences swore they were watching a man barely holding it together. They were wrong. Most nights, the glass was cold tea. Sometimes, apple juice. Occasionally, nothing at all. The ice was real, the clink deliberate. It sounded right. That was the point. He learned early that the illusion worked better than the truth. A man pretending not to care could say things a careful man never could. He could arrive late, skip rehearsals, glance at the band once and still hit the entrance perfectly. People called it laziness. What it really was distance, measured, controlled, protective. In the 60s, the schedule was brutal, even when no one admitted it. Television specials stacked back to back, recording sessions that bled into the early morning, contracts negotiated over handshakes that slowly stopped meaning anything. He walked onto sets, having barely looked at the rundown, not because he didn't respect the work, but because over-preparation made him visible. And being visible meant being reachable. The act let him stay just out of reach. The group that once filled rooms without trying began to thin without an argument. No shouting matches, no dramatic exits, just unanswered calls, separate cars, a silence that grew comfortable enough to avoid discussing. Frank hardened as the business shifted. The audience changed too. They wanted sharper edges, louder confessions. Vulnerability sold better when it looked like defiance. Dean watched it happen from a careful angle. He smiled when expected. He delivered when the red light came on. But the warmth people remembered wasn't demanded anymore. It was replaced by appetite. He felt it every time applause came a second too late or too fast, like a reflex instead of a response. Alcohol was never the engine. It was the curtain. A way to end the night without explaining the weight that came with being wanted for the wrong reasons. He didn't drink because he couldn't stop working. He drank because stopping meant listening. On stage, he was precise. The pauses were counted. The laughs anticipated. Even the mistakes were rehearsed in spirit, if not in detail. Walking out without a run-through wasn't arrogance. It was trust in instinct built over years of paying attention. Instinct never asked him how he felt. That was its greatest gift. By the 70s, the mask had hardened into expectation. People no longer questioned it. They repeated it for him. The drunk. The king who didn't care. He let them. It saved time. What they didn't see was how carefully he avoided attachment. How leaving early, staying light, playing the fool kept him from hoping the room would give something back. Hope, he'd learned, was expensive. He told himself it was freedom. Most days, that explanation was enough. He saw her again 2 days later, near the nurse's station, just past the turn where the corridor narrowed and the ceiling dipped slightly. The air there felt heavier, trapped by old vents and too many conversations that never finished. She was reviewing a chart, head tilted, reading slowly. She noticed him without looking up. "You're walking better," she said. He stopped. "That's the rumor?" She finally met his eyes. This time there was no testing, no careful distance, just acknowledgement. As if their last exchange had settled something between them and didn't need revisiting. He waited for the usual follow-up. None came. "I didn't catch your name," he said, then immediately wished he hadn't. It sounded like a line, even to him. She closed the chart. "You don't need it." That should have annoyed him. Instead, it disarmed him. They stood there, the muted hospital sounds threading around the pause. Somewhere a radio played softly behind a closed door. Talk radio, low and indistinct. A cart rolled by, life continuing without ceremony. "You shouldn't have said what you did," he said finally, not accusatory, observational. "I know," she replied. No apology. But it was true. He considered deflecting. The reflex was still there. He could feel it rising, ready to smooth the moment into something forgettable. He didn't use it. "Why?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted past him, toward the far end of the corridor where the light dimmed and the walls bore small, careful scuffs from gurneys. "My brother used to walk the way you do," she said. Head down, like gravity worked differently on him. Dean didn't interrupt. "He died 6 years ago," she continued. "Drunk driver. Not him. Someone else who thought the night would forgive anything." Her voice didn't crack. That was what made it harder to hear. "I don't blame you for anything," she added, almost too quickly, as if correcting a thought he hadn't voiced. "This isn't about guilt." "Then what is it about?" he asked. She looked back at him. Really looked this time. "Choice." The word hung there, plain and uncomfortable. "I see a lot of people who come in here when it's already decided," she said. "Bodies that won't cooperate anymore. Minds that checked out long before. They tell themselves stories because it's easier than admitting the door closed years ago." She paused, then softened. Not in tone, but in intent. "You're not one of them." Dean felt something shift, subtle but undeniable. Not relief, not fear. Recognition. "I'm not asking you to change," she went on. "I wouldn't know what that means for you. I'm just saying you're early." Early. The word felt strange applied to him. A silence settled between them, heavier than before. This one pressed inward. He searched for something clever, something to put distance back where it belonged. Nothing arrived. "I've had everything," he said quietly. It wasn't pride, it was inventory. "I know," she replied. "That's why you still have a choice." She glanced at the clock on the wall, already moving away. "Your test is in an hour," she said. "Business returning. Don't be late." She walked off without looking back. Dean remained where he was. He didn't turn on the television when he returned to his room. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting uselessly on his knees, listening to the building breathe. For the first time in a long while, there was nothing playing between his ears to keep the quiet out. The lights still came up on time. They always did. A soft rise at first, then brighter, flattening the shadows until the stage revealed itself completely. The band waited. The audience leaned forward with the familiar rustle of programs and expectation. From the house, it looked the same as it always had. Backstage, Dean stood a little farther from the doorway than before. No pacing. No last-second jokes. He listened to the muffled applause that signaled his cue, and felt it arrive without reaching him. There was a delay now, a thin but noticeable gap between sound and meaning. He adjusted his jacket out of habit, not vanity, and stepped forward. The set was shorter, fewer songs, less space between them. He avoided the loose detours that once made the room feel intimate, as if anything might happen. Now he moved cleanly from one number to the next, each transition efficient, almost careful. The band followed without question. They sensed it too. Applause still came, warm and generous, but it landed differently. It rose and fell like a wave that no longer pulled him with it. Between songs, the silence stretched just long enough to be felt. He filled it when required, not instinctively. A line here, a small smile there. Nothing wasted. From the front row, people blamed age. From farther back, they blamed the times. Neither was wrong, but neither was enough. Behind the curtain, he said almost nothing. No stories, no teasing. He nodded, thanked the crew, accepted a glass he barely touched. The ritual had lost its playfulness and become routine, stripped of pleasure but still stubbornly intact. He began leaving the stage faster, cutting short the lingering moment where performer and audience used to breathe together. The final note would fade, the lights dim, and he was already moving, as if staying another second might demand something he couldn't offer. What unsettled him most wasn't fatigue. It was the absence of response. Not from the crowd, they did their part, but from himself. The stage had always been armor. Now it felt thin, decorative, no longer capable of absorbing impact. On certain nights, a line surfaced uninvited. Not the whole conversation. Just one fragment, lodged where it couldn't be smoothed over. You still have a choice. He never finished the thought. Finishing it would have meant deciding what came next. Drinking followed the shows out of sequence, no longer tied to celebration or release. It was there in the background, a low constant, like stage noise you stop noticing until it disappears. It didn't lift him or drop him. It simply filled space. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. The bookings continued. The reviews remained respectful. People spoke of legacy with comfortable admiration. He listened without correcting them. What they couldn't see was how carefully he measured each appearance now. How stepping into the light felt less like escape and more like obligation. How the persona that once protected him no longer fit tightly enough to do its job. One night, as the curtain fell, he stood alone for a moment longer than usual, facing the empty rows while the crew moved around him. The room smelled of dust and heat, and something faintly electrical. For a brief second, he imagined staying there after everyone left, letting the quiet claim the space completely. He didn't. He turned and walked out, applause still echoing behind him, untouched. The lights shut off one by one, leaving the stage bare, functional, waiting. At home, the quiet arrived before he did. It settled into the rooms during the afternoon, long before sunset, occupying corners that once filled themselves with sound. Telephones rang less often now. When they did, he let them ring longer than necessary, listening not to the caller, but to his own reluctance. The family noticed the changes before he did. Or perhaps they noticed because he refused to. He spoke less, not out of irritation, but out of economy, as if words now required justification. Conversations shortened. Visits ended earlier. He stopped calling first, telling himself it was courtesy, not withdrawal. There was one exception. With Dean Paul, the rhythm changed. The jokes fell away quickly, without effort. They spoke plainly, sometimes awkwardly, circling topics that mattered instead of dancing around them. The uniform, the aircraft, the discipline of a life built on precision. None of it intimidated him. What unsettled him was how much of himself he recognized there. the control, the distance, the careful avoidance of chaos. They sat together one evening, no television on, the room lit by a single lamp that cast long, unhelpful shadows. His son talked about training schedules, about the way the sky looked at certain altitudes, about responsibility spoken of without drama. Dean listened, fully, the way he rarely did anymore. "Be careful," he said suddenly. The words surprised them both. Dean Paul looked up, searching for the familiar grin that usually softened moments like this. It didn't come. "I know," his son replied. Not dismissive, not defensive, just acknowledging the request. Later, alone with a friend, Dean spoke more than he intended. Not about fear, not directly, about timing, about roles that lasted longer than expected. Then, quietly, almost to himself, "I always thought I'd leave early. Now I'm afraid of staying." The admission hung there, unchallenged. He began to understand that being a father required something the stage never had: presence without performance. There was no applause to guide him, no script to retreat into. The realization came late, unannounced, and carried a weight he hadn't trained for. Sometimes his mind drifted back to the hospital corridor. Not the place itself, but the moment when someone saw past the outline and spoke anyway. The meaning had shifted. Choice no longer sounded like opportunity. It sounded like responsibility. The family gatherings continued, polite and careful. Laughter appeared when expected, but it faded faster. Everyone sensed the fragility without naming it. No one wanted to be the first to break the rhythm. Dean watched his son closely now, memorizing details he'd once taken for granted. The way he listened, the way he stood when he talked about flying, the way he believed, without question, that there would always be more time. Dean did not correct him. Not yet. The phone rang before the day had decided what it would be. Not loud, not urgent, just persistent enough to cut through the thin layer of sleep he hadn't fully entered. Dean reached for it without hurry, already aware that nothing good ever arrived at that hour. He didn't ask who it was. He didn't sit up. The voice on the other end spoke carefully. Too carefully. Names were exchanged, a location mentioned, then a sentence that ended without offering a place to respond. He did not ask for details. He stood while still holding the receiver, as if his body needed height to absorb the words. When the line went dead, he kept it to his ear for a moment longer, listening to the hollow sound that followed. It matched something inside him with uncomfortable precision. He didn't sit down, didn't reach for a drink, didn't call anyone. He stood in the quiet of the room, hands loose at his sides, staring at nothing in particular. The walls seemed farther apart than usual. The air felt neutral, almost polite. By mid-morning, everything scheduled for him had been erased. No announcements, no explanations. Messages were sent on his behalf. People accepted them without protest. That, more than anything, confirmed what had happened. Those who came to the house waited for a reaction they could recognize. Anger, collapse, sound. They found none of it. He answered questions when asked, briefly and without correction. He did not offer context. He did not search for comfort. What unsettled them was not his restraint, but the vacancy behind it. The world continued, unbothered. Cars passed. Neighbors watered lawns. Somewhere, a radio played a song he once knew well. None of it reached him. The loss arrived without violence, without ceremony. It simply removed something essential and left the space unmarked. At night, he lay awake without rehearsing the past. There were no images replayed, no imagined alternatives. The mind offered nothing. The absence was complete, efficient, merciless. A fragment returned to him then, a voice from years earlier, measured and unsentimental. You have a choice. He understood it differently now. Choice was not rescue. It did not promise reversal. It only meant responsibility for what remained after the damage was done. In the days that followed, he refused statements, declined condolences, avoided rooms where sympathy gathered too densely. He was not hiding. There was simply nothing he could add. The legend disappeared without announcement. No farewell, no final bow. Just a man who stopped answering the call when it rang. The house grew quieter, not suddenly, but permanently. He did not announce his leaving. There was no decision framed as such, no moment where doors closed dramatically behind him. He simply stopped returning to places that asked him to become someone he no longer recognized. Invitations arrived and were declined quietly. Interviews were offered, sweetened, insisted upon. He said no without explanation, and the world learned to accept the silence. The years rearranged themselves around his absence. He kept his routines small. Mornings unfolded without urgency. Afternoons passed without markers. He walked when his body allowed it, rested when it didn't. The voice that once carried rooms now lived almost entirely inside his head, unneeded, unexercised. It didn't ache. It waited. At some point, no date fixed firmly enough to be trusted, he found himself in another hospital. Different building, different decade. The same smell, the same carefully neutral light. Time had worn the place smooth, familiar in its indifference. He moved down the corridor at the pace his lungs permitted, eyes again tracing the line where the floor met the wall. The sound of carts, the distant murmur of staff, the rhythm of a place built around endings and continuations that never touched. He saw her, or someone like her. The certainty wasn't important. The posture was familiar. The way she stood slightly angled, as if prepared to listen or leave with equal readiness. She looked at him with the same unguarded attention, free of recognition or expectation. They stopped a few feet apart. I remembered, he said. That was all. No explanation followed. None was asked for. She nodded once, not in gratitude, not in forgiveness, just acknowledgement. The kind that accepts weight without trying to redistribute it. He walked past her before the moment could ask for more. What no one knew, what would surface only years later in the unremarkable language of paperwork, was that he had made arrangements long before. Payments made quietly, names never attached. Medical bills cleared for people who would never know who intervened. A fund established without ceremony, its purpose narrow, practical, human. There were no plaques, no press releases, nothing that could be mistaken for legacy building. When he died, the tributes spoke of charm, of ease, of a man who seemed untouched by consequence. They repeated the familiar outline. It was easier that way. The corridor remained, the same sound of footsteps, the same sterile air, the same silence that follows after someone decides not to perform what they feel. Only now, the listener knows what passed through it, and what didn't.